The wind howled across the Montana plains, carrying with it the sharp bite of a coming snowstorm. The last colors of dusk were fading behind the jagged silhouettes of pine and ridge, leaving the land in a cold, blue stillness. On the edge of that vast silence rode a young rancher named Daniel Creed. He was 28, tall, quiet, the kind of man who said little but worked until his hands bled. Folks in the nearby town of Red Rock called him Virgin Creed, half in jest, half in pity. He'd never married, never even been seen courting. The truth was simpler. His life had been too full of work and too empty of people. The land was his only companion, the cattle his only family. And that night, as snow began to fall in heavy flakes, Daniel was riding home from the far pasture, leading a tired mare through the wind when he saw movement by the creek. At first, he thought it was a fallen branch swaying, but as he drew closer, he saw the shape of a man, half covered in frost, trembling, trying to crawl toward a dying fire. Daniel dismounted instantly. The man was young, maybe 20, with dark skin and hair matted with snow. His clothes were thin, torn buckskin barely enough to keep out the cold. He was native, Sioux by the beadwork at his waist. His lips were blue, his hands raw. For a long second, Daniel hesitated. The war between settlers and tribes had ended only a few years back, but the hate still lingered in whispers and warnings. Yet as Daniel looked down at that shivering figure, he didn't see an enemy. He saw a human being freezing to death. Without a word, he stripped off his own sheepskin coat, the one his father had given him before he died, and wrapped it around the stranger's shoulders. The native tried to speak, but his voice cracked into the wind. Daniel built a small fire with what dry wood he could find and gave him the last of his bread. "Don't talk," he said softly. "Just breathe." The man's eyes flickered open, dark and filled with something Daniel couldn't name, gratitude, confusion, and pride all mixed together. Hours passed before the native could stand again. Daniel helped him onto his horse, leading both of them back toward the ranch. By the time they reached the barn, the storm had become a white wall. Inside, Daniel laid the man near the hearth, fed him broth, and covered him in blankets. The man finally spoke, his voice faint but steady. "You saved me. My name is Dakota." Daniel nodded. "Rest. You'll ride out when the storm's over." But Dakota shook his head. "You gave me life," he whispered. "That cannot be left unpaid." Daniel chuckled softly. "You don't owe me anything, friend." The words felt strange, friend. He hadn't used it in years. The storm lasted 3 days. In that time, Dakota healed enough to speak more. He told Daniel he had been hunting when he was caught in the blizzard, separated from his band. He spoke of hunger, of loss, of trying to bring food back to his people. Daniel listened without judgment. When the sky finally cleared, Dakota prepared to leave. He returned the coat, neatly folded, insisting it belonged to the man who had earned it through kindness. Daniel tried to refuse, but Dakota only smiled and said, "When a gift saves a life, it becomes sacred. But debts of honor must be returned." He mounted a borrowed horse, promised to come back someday, and rode into the sunrise. Daniel watched until the figure vanished beyond the pines. Weeks passed. Life returned to routine, mending fences, tending cattle, watching the cold turn the world to silver. Daniel sometimes thought of Dakota but assumed he would never see him again. Then one evening, as the sky turned blood red, the sound of distant hoofbeats reached the ranch. At first Daniel thought it was the mail rider or a passing trader. But the sound grew louder, multiplied, dozens, then hundreds of hooves pounding in rhythm. He stepped onto his porch, rifle in hand more out of habit than fear. Over the ridge, like shadows spilling from the forest, came riders, scores of them, 200 at least. All painted, all proud, their faces marked with the colors of the plains. Daniel's breath caught. At their head rode Dakota, wrapped in a new buffalo cloak, his expression solemn but peaceful. They stopped at the fence line, not crossing, just waiting in perfect silence. The air was so still that Daniel could hear his own heartbeat. Then Dakota dismounted and walked forward alone, carrying Daniel's old sheepskin coat folded over his arm. When he reached the fence, he laid it gently across the rail. "You gave warmth when the land gave death," he said, voice strong. "You saw no tribe, no color, no enemy. Only a man, and for that, my people will remember you as one of our own." Daniel, overwhelmed, tried to speak, but his throat closed. Dakota gestured behind him, and one by one, the warriors dismounted and laid gifts along the fence: bows, hides, beaded belts, carved talismans, baskets of corn, bundles of cured meat. Each placed something down, then bowed their heads in silence. It wasn't wealth they were giving, it was honor, respect, and remembrance. Daniel finally managed to speak, his voice barely a whisper. "You didn't have to do this." Dakota smiled faintly. "A debt of honor isn't paid in gold. It's paid in truth." Then he lifted a hand, and the warriors gave a cry that echoed across the valley, a deep, resonant chant that made the horses tremble and Daniel's heart swell. It wasn't a war cry, it was something older, something sacred. It was gratitude in its purest form. When the chant ended, Dakota looked at Daniel one last time. "Your kindness will be told to our children. They will remember the white man who gave warmth instead of bullets." And just like that, they turned and rode away, disappearing back into the wilderness, leaving the gifts behind. The snow began to fall again, softly this time, as if the land itself was blessing the moment. Daniel stood there for a long while, staring at the coat still resting on the fence. It looked different now, less like a piece of cloth, more like a symbol of something bigger than both of them. He walked forward, picked it up, and held it against his chest. Inside the lining, he found something tucked carefully into the pocket, a small eagle feather, bound with a strip of red thread. It was a sign of highest respect among the Sioux, something given only to warriors or those who had performed a sacred act. Tears burned his eyes. He had never fought in a battle, never saved a town, never done anything the world would call heroic. All he had done was share warmth with a freezing man. But in that simple act, he had built a bridge between two worlds divided by blood and fear. That night, Daniel sat by his fire, the feather resting beside him, and thought about what it all meant. He realized something profound. Compassion doesn't just save lives, it changes them. The kindness you offer when no one's watching can echo farther than bullets, farther than hate, farther even than time. For the first time in years, Daniel felt at peace, not because he'd gained something, but because he'd given without expecting anything back. The next morning, when the sun rose over the valley, it lit up the gift still lying by the fence, glimmering like jewels in the frost. The people in town later heard about what had happened. Some said it was a miracle. Some didn't believe it at all. But Daniel didn't care for their talk. He didn't tell the story to boast or seek praise. He simply said, "Sometimes, the smallest kindness can turn strangers into brothers." And that became the truth he lived by. In the years that followed, Daniel's ranch prospered. Travelers who passed through often found food and shelter there, no matter who they were. Word spread of the quiet rancher who welcomed everyone, and soon, his land became a place of peace, where cowboys and natives alike could rest side by side without fear. Every winter, Daniel hung the old coat by the door and placed the feather above the hearth. It reminded him that the world could be cruel, but hearts didn't have to be. Decades later, when Daniel grew old and gray, children would visit him to hear the story of the night 200 warriors lined up at his fence. His voice, though rough with age, would soften when he spoke of Dakota, the man who returned not for revenge, but for gratitude. "He taught me something no book ever could," Daniel would say. "That a man's worth isn't in his land or his name, it's in the warmth he shares when someone's cold." When Daniel passed away one quiet spring evening, they found him sitting in his chair by the fire, the feather still resting in his palm. The coat hung on the wall behind him, untouched, as though waiting for another traveler in need. The people buried him on the hill overlooking the valley, and on the night after his burial, a strange thing happened. A group of riders appeared on the horizon, descendants of Dakota's people, carrying torches that glowed like stars. They rode silently to his grave, placed fresh pine boughs and wildflowers, and left the mark of their tribe carved into the wooden cross. He gave warmth. None of the townsfolk dared to disturb them. They watched from afar as the riders sang a low, haunting song that carried through the night, blending with the whisper of the wind. It was the same chant Daniel had heard that night so many years ago, a song of honor. When dawn came, the riders were gone, and the only sign they had been there was a single white feather resting atop the mound of earth. Over time, the story became legend in Red Rock. Some said it was exaggerated, others swore their grandparents had seen it happen. But among those who knew Daniel personally, the memory remained sharp and true. They remembered his eyes, the quiet strength in them, the peace of a man who had found meaning in mercy. Travelers still stopped by his old ranch, now run by a family that kept his tradition alive. The coat, patched and faded, still hung by the door, and every child who passed through was told never to mock a stranger or ignore a cry for help. Because once, They'd say, a rancher gave his coat to a freezing man, and the world became a little warmer because of it. Years later, long after the wars and the hatred had faded into history, a descendant of Dakota returned. His name was Chaska, a young man with sharp eyes and the same calm spirit. He came to see the grave, carrying an old bundle wrapped in leather. Inside was Daniel's sheepskin coat, preserved with care across generations. Chaska knelt, placed it before the grave, and said softly, "Our story's live because of your kindness. My grandfather's spirit never forgot." Then he left the feather he wore in his own hair beside the first one, bowing deeply before riding away into the horizon. That day, the sky over the valley turned a deep golden red, and the wind blew softly through the grass, as if the land itself remembered the warmth once shared there. It was not the story of a war or a conquest. It was the story of a coat, a moment of mercy, and a bond of honor between two men from worlds that had once feared each other. In that single act of humanity, Daniel Creed had done what governments and armies never could. He'd built peace, not with power, but with compassion. And as long as the wind whispered through the Montana hills, the legend of the rancher who gave his coat to a shivering native, and the 200 warriors who repaid his kindness, would live on, reminding anyone who heard it that even in the coldest world, one warm heart can change everything.